The observation chamber smelled like ozone and fear sweat. David Higgins pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner for the third time, watching the green light pulse beneath his skin like a trapped firefly. The technician badge said Marcus. Eyes said he'd seen too many rich people cry. Adjusted the neural interface crown on David's head. "Remember?" Marcus said, voice flat as old soda. "You're incorporeal. Can't touch. Can't speak. Can't change anything. The second you try, the system yanks you back. 24 hours from your arrival point, you return automatically." David nodded. His throat clicked when he swallowed. "May 14th, 2022, Marcus confirmed, fingers dancing across a holographic display. "Your wedding day." "That's right," David said quietly. Marcus paused, hand hovering over the activation sequence. "You sure about this? Most people who go back to happy memories." He trailed off, professional boundaries reasserting themselves. "Just send me," David said. The world collapsed into a single point of white-hot light, then exploded outward in reverse. David's consciousness stretched like taffy pulled between dimensions. His last coherent thought before the temporal displacement was that he'd forgotten to cancel his 3 o'clock. He materialized in the garden behind the Fairmont Hotel, invisible, intangible, watching his younger self adjust a bow tie in the reflection of a champagne flute. Christ, had he really been that thin? That young David, 32, all sharp angles and nervous energy, kept checking his watch. Vintage Rolex his father had left him. The same watch sitting in a safety deposit box in 2042, unworn for a decade. 5 minutes, someone called. Best man. Kevin. Dead now. Car accident in 2031. Young David knocked back the champagne in one gulp, and present David felt the ghost of bubbles he couldn't taste. The sensation of observing himself created a peculiar vertigo, like looking at your reflection in a mirror that's half a second behind. He followed his younger self through the French doors into the preparation room. The groomsmen lounged in rented tuxedos, making the kind of jokes men make when they're trying not to think about mortality and commitment. Young David stood apart, thumb spinning the wedding ring in his pocket like a worry stone. "You good?" Kevin asked, squeezing young David's shoulder. "Define good," young David replied. "Not puking, not running." "Then I'm spectacular." They laughed, and David remembered that laugh, how it had felt genuine then, not the performed thing it would become. He watched his younger self straighten, shoulders squaring with decision. That was the thing about the past. Everything looked like prophecy in reverse. The string quartet started Pachelbel's canon. David drifted through the wall into the main hall, 200 guests in their finest, all facing forward like congregants awaiting revelation. He recognized faces that would fade from their lives, colleagues who'd become competitors, friends who'd become strangers, relatives who'd become obituaries. Then Elizabeth entered, and time did that thing it doesn't actually do but feels like it does. She wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her swimmer's shoulders, dark hair pinned up with baby's breath that would wilt before the reception ended. But it was her face that stopped him. Both David's, past and present. She looked terrified, and certain in equal measure, like someone about to jump from a plane who'd already decided the parachute would work. Present, David moved closer, close enough to see the small scar on her temple from a childhood bicycle accident, close enough to count the freckles across her nose that makeup couldn't quite hide. 20 years later, she'd stopped trying to hide them. 20 years later, she'd stopped trying to hide a lot of things. Young David's face transformed when he saw her. Present. David watched his own expression shift from anxiety to something beyond words. Not just love, recognition, as if he'd been looking for her his whole life without knowing her face. The ceremony blurred past in fragments, vows they'd written themselves, too earnest to repeat at dinner parties. The ring sliding onto Elizabeth's finger, her hands shaking so hard the officiant had to pause. Young David whispering something that made her laugh. What had he said? David couldn't remember, couldn't hear it now. The temporal displacement muffling sounds that weren't meant for him. The kiss was awkward, noses bumping, but the crowd erupted anyway. Young David and Elizabeth turned to face their future, and present David saw what he'd missed the first time. The flicker of panic in Elizabeth's eyes, quickly suppressed, the way her smile went rigid for just a moment before warming again. The reception was held in the ballroom next door. Fairy lights and forced mingling. David followed the newlyweds through their choreographed dance, through the cake cutting, Elizabeth smashing a piece into young David's face despite their agreement not to through the endless toasts. Kevin's was funny. Elizabeth's sister Sarah's was weepy. David's business partner made jokes about prenups that landed like lead balloons. But David wasn't watching the speeches. He was watching Elizabeth. She moved through the party like a professional. Laugh here, hug there, always the right response at the right time. But twice he caught her alone. Once by the gift table, staring at the wrapped boxes like they were puzzle pieces that didn't fit. Once on the balcony, gripping the railing hard enough to whiten her knuckles, breathing deep like she was trying to memorize the smell of gardenias and possibility. Then came the moment. Elizabeth excused herself during the band's break, saying something about fixing her lipstick. But instead of heading to the bathroom, she slipped into the library adjacent to the ballroom, a quiet room the hotel kept for guests who needed escape from events. David followed, his incorporeal form passing through the heavy oak door. The library was dim, lit only by 2 green banker's lamps and the city lights bleeding through tall windows. Elizabeth moved with purpose to a shelf near the back, running her fingers along spines until she found what she was looking for. A slim volume of Emily Dickinson, leather-bound and pristine. David recognized it immediately. His mother's gift, presented that morning with typical maternal certainty that every marriage needs poetry. Neither he nor Elizabeth had opened it. Poetry was his mother's thing, not theirs. They were practical people. Code and contracts, algorithms and acquisitions. Elizabeth glanced toward the door, then pulled something from the hidden pocket in her dress, the one she'd had the seamstress add for her phone and lipstick. But it wasn't either of those things. It was a letter, folded into a tight square. She opened the book to its middle, tucked the letter inside, and closed it carefully. For a moment, she held the book against her chest like she was saying goodbye to something. Then she slid it back onto the shelf. 3rd row from the bottom, nestled between Whitman and Yeats. The door opened. Young David peered in, backlit by party light. "There you are," he said. "Your sister's threatening to sing." Elizabeth turned, and her smile was real but complicated, like a math equation with imaginary numbers. "We should definitely prevent that." She crossed to him, took his offered hand. Before leaving, she looked back once at the bookshelf, just once, then let herself be led back to their celebration. Present David stayed in the library, staring at the book. He couldn't touch it, couldn't open it, couldn't read what she'd hidden. But he memorized its position, the worn spot on the spine. The way the gold lettering had already started to fade, the next few hours passed in a blur of observation, dancing, drinking, the slow dissolution of formality as ties came off and heels were abandoned. He watched young David and Elizabeth leave in a shower of biodegradable confetti, climbing into the Tesla decorated with smart paint that displayed increasingly embarrassing messages from their friends. As the 24 hours neared its end, David felt the pull of his own time beginning. The edges of 2022 started to fray, colors bleeding like watercolors in rain. The last thing he saw was the library through the window, the green lamp still glowing, the books standing sentinel over their secrets. The return was worse than the departure. Every atom of his being screamed as it was dragged forward through 20 years in 20 seconds. He gasped back into consciousness in the observation chamber, Marcus already removing the neural crown. "How was it?" Marcus asked. The question obviously rote. David's mouth tasted like copper and regret. Educational. The house felt different when David returned from the Temporal observation facility. Same marble foyer, same abstract art Elizabeth had chosen, same silence that had replaced conversation years ago. But now he moved through it like an intruder, hypersensitive to every detail. the coffee maker still warm from Elizabeth's morning routine. Her reading glasses folded on yesterday's crossword, 3 squares left empty. She was at her Thursday board meeting. Wouldn't be home until 8. David climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, to the library they'd built but rarely used. Who has time to read? They'd joke to guests, gesturing at the custom shelves filled with books ordered by color rather than content. A designer had done that, said it was more visually harmonious. The poetry section was in the back corner, overlooked and underloved. David's fingers trembled as he found the spine. Dickinson, leather-bound, his mother's gift. He pulled it free, and dust motes swirled in the afternoon light like tiny planets knocked from orbit. The book fell open to its middle, muscle memory from 20 years of hiding. The letter was there, but the paper was crisp, new, the ink fresh enough to smudge when his thumb brushed it. His hands shook as he unfolded it, Elizabeth's handwriting spreading across the page like a map to somewhere impossible. May 13th, 2042. David, I know you're watching. I always knew. Thank you for not interfering. If you had, we would never have existed. I made my trip too. I watched you watching me. Trust the journey. Trust us. E. David read it 3 times before his legs gave out. He sat hard on the library floor, letter clutched like evidence of a crime or a miracle. May 13th, 2042. Yesterday. But she'd placed it in 2022. But he'd just watched her place it. But his phone buzzed. Elizabeth. Board's running long. Don't wait for dinner. He stared at the message, then at the letter, then at the book that had held an impossible secret for 2 decades. The logical part of his brain, the part that had built a fortune on understanding systems, tried to map the causality. She went back. When? Why? To watch what? David pulled up the Temporal Observation Facility's client portal on his phone. His access let him see booking records, anonymized but searchable by date ranges. He filtered for observations of May 14th, 2022. His wedding day. 3 entries in the past 5 years. His from today. 2 others, subjects redacted, but one from 3 weeks ago, the other from 11 months back. 3 weeks ago, Elizabeth had said she was visiting her sister in Portland. 11 months ago, she'd been at a conference in Singapore. Or so she'd said. David set the letter on the floor, smoothed its creases, and really looked at it. The handwriting was Elizabeth's, but not quite. 20 years had changed her script the way it had changed everything else, made it more efficient, less flowery. This was her current writing, not her young hand. She knew he was watching. How? He'd been invisible, incorporeal. Unless she'd been there too, another ghost in the machine, watching him watch their past. David's mind raced through possibilities. The technology allowed multiple observers of the same time frame. He knew that from the technical specifications. They couldn't see each other, couldn't interact, but they could occupy the same temporal space, like parallel universes intersecting at a single point. But the letter, the physical letter, how could she place something yesterday in a book 20 years ago? He called the facility. Temporal observation. How may I direct your call? A receptionist answered. I need to speak with someone about temporal paradoxes, David said. I'll transfer you to our theoretical department. Hold music. Synthetic Bach. Then a voice he recognized. Dr. Sarah Chen, the physicist whose papers had made commercial time travel possible. Mr. Higgins, she said warmly. I wondered when you'd call. You know who I am? David asked, surprised. I know everyone who uses our services, especially those who discover anomalies. Anomalies. The letter, I assume, Dr. Chen said. Or has your wife mentioned her visits? David's throat constricted. You know about Elizabeth? Mr. Higgins, what do you think happens when someone observes their past? Nothing happens, David said. You can't change anything. I said you can't change the past, Dr. Chen interrupted gently. But observation itself is an action, a quantum event. Every observation creates let's call it a resonance, a connection between the moment observed and the moment of observation. That doesn't explain the letter, David said, doesn't it? Dr. Chen's voice carried the patience of someone explaining rain to a child. Your wife placed that letter 20 years ago, but she placed it after observing you observe her. The letter existed because you would read it. You read it because it existed. The loop is stable. That's impossible. So was time travel until it wasn't, she replied. A pause. Mr. Higgins, did you ever wonder why we require such extensive psychological screening? Liability, David said. Partially, but mainly because some people can't handle the truth about time. It's not a river flowing in one direction. It's more like, she paused, searching for words, like a symphony. Every note exists simultaneously. We just experience them in sequence. Elizabeth knew I would go back, David said slowly. Or you went back because she knew. Causality is negotiable at quantum scales. David hung up. His head felt like it might split open. He picked up the letter again, noticed something he'd missed. A postscript, tiny, almost invisible. P.S. Check the attic, behind the Christmas decorations. The attic was Elizabeth's domain, where she exiled things too sentimental to discard, but too painful to keep visible. David climbed the pull-down ladder, phone flashlight cutting through dust-thick air. Behind boxes of ornaments they hadn't used since hosting became too much effort, he found a filing box labeled 2022-2023 taxes. Inside, hundreds of letters, all in Elizabeth's handwriting, all addressed to him, all dated from different points in their marriage, but written on paper that looked fresh as morning. He opened one at random. March 3rd, 2024. You're probably wondering about the conference in Tokyo. I wasn't there. I was watching us fight about my mother moving in, watching you bite back what you really wanted to say, watching myself do the same. We got so good at not saying things. Another. December 15th, 2030. Today I watched you watch me leave for Sarah's wedding alone. You said you had a deadline. I said I understood. We both lied so gracefully. And another, August 9th, 2035. I went back to watch the day we stopped sharing a bedroom. Neither of us acknowledged it, just slowly migrated to separate spaces like continental drift. I wanted to see whose idea it was. Turns out it was nobody's. It just happened. The saddest things always just happen. David read until his phone battery died, until the attic's stuffy air made him dizzy. Each letter was a confession, an observation, a piece of Elizabeth watching their marriage dissolve from the future, looking for the moment it broke. She'd made dozens of trips, maybe hundreds, all secret, all searching. The front door opened downstairs, Elizabeth's heels on marble, that specific rhythm he'd know anywhere. "David?" she called. He climbed down from the attic, letters clutched in both hands like evidence. She stood in the foyer, still in her board meeting armor, charcoal suit, silver earrings, expression unreadable. "You found them," she said softly. "How long have you been going back?" David asked. 3 years, Elizabeth said. She set down her bag, moved toward the kitchen. He followed. She poured wine for both of them without asking. Muscle memory of 20 years. Started with our anniversary dinner, the 15th. "You remember, the restaurant lost our reservation," David said. "We ended up at that awful place with the mime. I wanted to see if we were happy then, if we laughed." She took a sip. "We did. We laughed so hard you snorted wine." "I don't remember that." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I didn't either. That's why I had to go back." They stood across the kitchen island from each other, the distance suddenly measurable in more than feet. "The letter," David said. "The one in the book. How?" "Dr. Chen calls it a stable temporal loop," Elizabeth explained. "The letter exists because you found it. You found it because it exists. It doesn't matter when I wrote it, only that I would write it after seeing you see me hide it." "That's insane." "Yes." Elizabeth smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in years. "Isn't it wonderful? 20 years that letter waited. Patient as stone. I wrote it yesterday knowing you'd already read it today." David set down his wine glass harder than necessary. the sound sharp against granite. "You've been watching us for 3 years. Our whole marriage, like some kind of experiment." "Not watching us," Elizabeth said quietly. "Watching me, trying to understand when I stopped trying, when we stopped trying. And there wasn't a when. It was like—" She turned the wineglass in her hands, watching the light refract through burgundy. "You know how erosion works? No one sees it happening. One day you just notice the cliff is gone." David pulled out one of the letters, read aloud. "September 2nd, 2028. Watched you order my drink wrong at Starbucks. Oat milk, not soy. 3 years of oat milk, you still said soy. I didn't correct you. Why didn't I correct you?" "Because it was easier than explaining I'd changed," Elizabeth said. "Just like you never told me you started hating golf. Kept going every Sunday because you thought I expected it." "You knew?" David said, stunned. "I went back and watched. You in the parking lot, sitting in your car for 20 minutes before going in. The look on your face." She laughed, but it came out cracked. "We became so careful with each other, like we were handling explosives." David spread the letters across the counter. Dozens of moments, dissected and preserved. Their marriage as archaeology. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" he asked. "In the present, our present. Would you have listened? Would I have?" Elizabeth moved around the island. Closer, but not close. "We perfected the art of being in the same room without being together. Every conversation scripted to avoid conflict. Remember our counselor? Dr. Martinez," David said. "She said we were the most polite couple she'd ever treated," Elizabeth recalled. "Like we were afraid of breaking something already broken." David picked up another letter, this one describing the day they'd stopped saying "I love you" before sleep. Not a decision, just a habit that died quietly, unmourned until its absence became louder than its presence ever was. "So you wrote these instead," he said. "Conversations with yourself." "With you," Elizabeth corrected. "I knew you'd go back eventually. You're predictable that way. When something breaks, you need to understand the mechanics. I just had to wait. You could have told me you were going." "And said what?" Elizabeth asked. "Honey, I'm time-traveling to watch our relationship die in slow motion." She shook her head. "Besides, I think I needed to do it alone, to see myself clearly without the performance of being seen." David thought about that. The performance of marriage, the exhausting choreography of avoiding each other's sharp edges. He'd watched it today in their younger selves. All that desperate hope, that certainty that they'd be different, better, more than the sum of their parents' failures. "What did you see?" he asked. "When you watched me watching you?" Elizabeth's face shifted, something raw flickering through. "I saw you looking for the moment I stopped loving you." "Did you find it? The moment you stopped?" "That's the thing, I didn't stop," Elizabeth said. "It just changed shape. Love became logistics. Passion became patience. We turned into business partners running a life together." She gestured at the kitchen, the house, the accumulated evidence of 20 years. Good business partners, efficient, profitable, stable, lonely, David added. That too. They stood in their expensive kitchen, surrounded by the best things money could buy. Two ghosts haunting their own lives. The silence stretched, but for once it didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, like the moment before a decision. "I have something else," Elizabeth said. She pulled out her phone, opened the Temporal observation app. "Look at this." She showed him her booking history. Dozens of trips, but not all to their past. Some to dates he didn't recognize. 2047, he read. 2051, 2063. "Elizabeth, these are future dates," she confirmed. "The technology goes both ways. Forward is harder, more expensive, but possible." David's mind reeled. "You've seen our future?" "A future. 5 years from now. 10. 20. She pulled up a video file. "The facility records everything for liability. Watch." The screen showed Elizabeth, older, grayer, elegant in the way of women who've earned their lines, sitting alone at a kitchen table. Not this kitchen. Somewhere smaller, warmer. She was reading, occasionally laughing at something in the book. A cat David didn't recognize wound around her ankles. "Where am I?" David asked quietly. "I don't know. I couldn't find you. Maybe you're at work. Maybe we're divorced. Maybe—" She stopped. "The point is, I looked happy, alone, but not lonely. And I realized something." "What?" "We've been so afraid of ending that we forgot to live," Elizabeth said. "We're preserving something that died years ago because we don't know how to bury it kindly." David wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. They'd become curators of a marriage, maintaining its appearance while its essence evaporated. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said. She handed him an envelope, his name written on it. "I wrote this before you left this morning, before you went back." Inside, a single sheet. "David, by the time you read this, you'll have seen what I wanted you to see. Not the letter in the book that was just to get your attention, but us, young, terrified, making promises we didn't understand. Here's what I learned from all my watching. We weren't wrong to try. We weren't foolish to hope. We were just human, thinking love was a destination instead of a journey. I don't regret us. Any of it. Even the quiet years, the careful years, the years we spent as strangers sharing a house. It all mattered. It all led here. To this moment. To this choice. We can keep going, maintaining the museum of our marriage. Or we can admit what we both know. We've become different people than the ones who made those vows. Not worse people. Just different. I'm not asking for a divorce. I'm asking for honesty. For the first real conversation we've had in years. The future isn't fixed. I've seen a dozen versions. In some, we separate kindly. In some, we find each other again. In some, we become the friends we should have been all along. But in all of them, the one constant is this. We stop being afraid. Your move. Elizabeth. David looked up from the letter. Elizabeth was crying but smiling too, like someone at a funeral for a person who'd lived well. "When did you know?" he asked. "When did you know I'd go back today?" "This morning," Elizabeth said. "The way you looked at me over breakfast, like you were trying to memorize my face, the same way you looked on our wedding day. You remember that? I went back and watched it. You, seeing me for the first time in that dress, your face just opened, like every door in your heart unlocked at once." She wiped her eyes. "You haven't looked at me that way in so long. But this morning, for just a second, you did. And I knew." David reached across the space between them, took her hand, not like a husband, like a friend, like someone who'd traveled through time with her, even when they didn't know it. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know. That's the point," Elizabeth said. "For the first time in years, I don't know what happens next." She squeezed his hand. "Isn't that terrifying?" "Yes." "Isn't it wonderful?" "Yes." They stood there, holding hands across the wreckage of 20 years. Two time travelers who'd finally arrived at the present. Outside, the world continued its spin, indifferent to personal apocalypses. But inside this kitchen, in this moment, everything was possible again. "I have a confession," David said. "I booked another trip, tomorrow, to watch the day we met." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose. "The conference in Boston? I want to see us before we were us," David explained. "When we were just two people at a bar, arguing about artificial intelligence." "I threw a drink in your face," Elizabeth said. "You threw a drink near my face. Important distinction." They were laughing now, the sound rusty but real. "Can I come?" Elizabeth asked. "To watch us begin?" David thought about it. Two ghosts observing their origin story, seeing themselves before the weight of promises, before mortgages and miscarriages, before success made them too careful to fail. "Yes," he said. "Let's go together." Elizabeth pulled him into a hug, not passionate, not desperate, just human. "Look at us, time travelers saving our marriage by ending it. Or ending it by saving it," David said. "Same thing, maybe." They separated, but the distance felt different now, intentional, rather than accidental, chosen rather than defaulted. "David," Elizabeth said, moving toward the stairs, "that letter in the book, at our wedding, want to know what else it said?" There was more. She paused at the landing, looking back with an expression he couldn't read. "I wrote, 20 years from now you'll think we failed. We didn't. We just completed the journey. Some stories are meant to have endings. That doesn't make them tragedies." She climbed the stairs, leaving David alone with the letters, the wine, the weight of temporal loops and human hearts. He picked up the one from the wedding again, held it to the light. The paper was new, but the words were 20 years old, or written yesterday, or both, or neither. Time, he was learning, wasn't linear. Neither was love. He pulled out his phone and called the facility. "Temporal observation. How may I—" the receptionist began. "I need to book 2 tickets," David interrupted. "Tomorrow, September 15th, 2019. "The day you met your wife," the receptionist noted. "The day I met my friend Elizabeth," David corrected. "We just didn't know it yet." The next morning they went back together. They stood invisible in that Boston bar, watching their younger selves collide like particles in an accelerator, all heat and possibility. They watched young Elizabeth throw the drink. They watched young David laugh instead of leave. They watched the beginning, knowing the ending, and found peace in the loop. Because that's what love was, maybe. Not a line, but a circle. Not a destination, but the journey around and around. Each revolution different. Each return a choice. They came back to 2042 holding hands. Not as spouses anymore, but as something else. Something new. Or maybe something they'd always been, underneath the years and the trying. Time travelers, story keepers, friends who knew each other across decades, forward and back. The divorce papers were signed a month later. They sold the house, divided the assets, separated their lives with the same efficiency they'd once joined them. But they kept the letters, and the book of poetry, with its impossible note tucked inside like a promise that transcended time. Sometimes they still travel back, together or alone, watching their story unfold, knowing how it ends, grateful for every moment of it. Because the ending, they learned, wasn't the point. The point was that they'd tried, they'd loved, they'd let go. And in the quantum foam of possibility, in some timeline, some version of them was always just beginning, forever throwing that drink, forever laughing, forever young and stupid and brave enough to believe that love was simple. It wasn't, but it was worth it. It was always worth it.